Somewhere right now, someone brilliant is lying awake, rerunning a 5-minute conversation from 6 hours ago for the 11th time, certain that this pass, unlike the previous 10, will finally produce the insight that lets them stop. It won't. It didn't the first time either, but the part of the mind running this loop doesn't have access to that information because it isn't actually trying to find an answer. It's doing something else entirely and mistaking that something else for thinking is the whole trap. Overthinking isn't a thinking problem. That's the sentence this entire video is going to build toward, and it's going to sound wrong for most of the next 20 minutes, because overthinking looks, sounds, and feels exactly like thinking, just louder, longer, and less able to stop. By the end, you'll understand the actual mechanism underneath it, and you'll have a specific test you can run this week that tells you whether you're solving a problem or performing the appearance of solving one. Stay for that part. It's not what most people expect. The trap nobody sees coming. Here's the pattern before the psychology of why. Smart people are disproportionately prone to overthinking for a reason that sounds like a compliment and functions like a curse. They're good at generating alternatives. A sharp mind doesn't see one possible interpretation of an ambiguous text message. It sees four, instantly, unbidden, each one plausible enough to require consideration. A less analytical mind might read the same message, feel a flicker of unease, and move on within a minute, simply because it isn't equipped to manufacture the other three interpretations in the first place. This is the central irony of the whole condition, the very cognitive horsepower that makes someone excellent at their job, the pattern recognition, the ability to model multiple outcomes, the refusal to accept the first plausible answer, is the identical machinery producing 3 a.m. spirals about a sentence they said 4 days ago. It isn't a different system malfunctioning. It's the same system, running exactly as designed, pointed at a target it was never built to solve, an emotional uncertainty rather than a technical one. Technical problems have an actual answer waiting at the end of enough analysis. Emotional uncertainty frequently does not. It has an outcome that has to be lived into, not solved for. But a mind trained by years of success to believe that sufficient analysis always eventually produces the answer keeps applying the same tool to a problem that tool cannot close. That mismatch, not any deficiency in the person, is where the loop is born. There's a reinforcement history behind this that makes it almost inevitable for high performers specifically. From early on, analytical effort got rewarded, consistently and visibly. The extra hour of studying that produced the higher grade, the extra pass on the report that caught the error nobody else saw, the extra scenario considered that avoided the costly mistake. Every one of those moments taught the same lesson: more thinking produces better outcomes. That lesson is true often enough in enough domains to become a deeply trusted rule. Nobody ever sits a bright, diligent person down and teaches them the domains where the rule stops applying, where more thinking doesn't produce a better outcome, it just produces more thinking. So the rule gets applied everywhere, including in the one category of problem where it silently, invisibly stops working. Anything that depends on another person's unknowable interior state, or on a future that hasn't happened yet and doesn't care how many times it's been mentally rehearsed. Point 1. Thinking feels like doing something. Call him Femi, 31, a data analyst, someone whose entire professional value is built on not moving forward until he's confident in the numbers. He described the pattern to us this way: if I'm still thinking about it, it feels like I haven't given up, like I'm still working the problem. Stopping feels like admitting I don't know. This is the first and most load-bearing piece of the mechanism. Overthinking masquerades as productivity. Sitting with a problem, turning it over, examining it from another angle. This is a genuinely useful behavior in almost every domain of Femi's professional life, which is exactly why his mind refuses to flag it as harmful when it happens at midnight about a conversation with his brother. The behavior looks identical from the inside, whether it's producing insight or just producing heat. There's no internal alarm that goes off when analysis stops being useful and starts being compulsive, because compulsive analysis borrows the same felt sense of diligence that useful analysis has. Here's what makes this especially hard to interrupt. Stopping doesn't feel like relief to a mind like Femi's. It feels like surrender. Walking away from an unresolved thought loop registers at a gut level as the same category of failure as walking away from an unfinished spreadsheet, leaving something undone that competence would have finished. Except there's nothing to finish. The spreadsheet has an end state. The 3 a.m. spiral about what his brother meant by one sentence does not, because there was never a hidden correct answer buried in that sentence waiting to be extracted through enough analysis. There's just a person guessing, and calling the guessing, figuring it out. Femi described one more detail that turns out to be common across almost everyone we spoke to in this pattern. The spiral doesn't feel bad the entire time. There are moments inside it that feel almost productive. A new angle occurs to him, and for a few seconds there's a small hit of something like progress, enough to justify continuing. That intermittent sense of almost getting somewhere is what keeps the loop going long after it stopped producing anything useful. It's not constant discomfort holding him there. It's occasional, real feeling momentum, arriving just often enough to make stopping feel premature every single time. Point 2. The illusion of control. Call her Ngozi, 26, in her final year of a graduate program, someone who has spent, by her own estimate, hundreds of hours mentally rehearsing conversations that never happened the way she rehearsed them. Job interviews, breakups, confrontations with friends, entire arguments played out shot for shot in her head days before, sometimes weeks before, the actual event, if the event happened at all. Her stated reason, almost word for word what we hear from people in this pattern across completely different life situations. If I've already imagined every version of how it could go wrong, then nothing can catch me off guard. This is the second mechanism, and it's a genuinely reasonable strategy that has simply generalized far past the domain where it actually works. Rehearsal helps when the future event has a knowable structure, a presentation with a set format, a negotiation with defined terms. In those cases, running scenarios in advance does improve outcomes. That's not superstition, that's preparation. The problem is that the same rehearsal instinct gets applied to situations with no fixed structure at all. How a friend will react to hard news, how a difficult conversation with a parent will unfold, where the actual range of human response is far too wide for any amount of pre-simulation to meaningfully narrow down. So the rehearsal keeps running, and it keeps failing to produce the sense of readiness it's supposed to produce, because the target keeps moving in a way rehearsal can't chase. Ngozi isn't irrational for doing this. She's applying a strategy that has worked for her academically and professionally her entire life. Prepare exhaustively, eliminate surprise, to a category of problem where exhaustive preparation doesn't reduce uncertainty, it just produces exhaustion. The control is illusory, but the exhaustion is completely real, and it accumulates the same way whether the rehearsal was useful or not. There's a cruel twist specific to Ngozi's version of this. The more scenarios she runs, the more plausible-sounding future outcomes accumulate in her memory, and her mind doesn't reliably tag them as imagined afterward. Days later, some of those hypothetical conversations feel almost as real, almost as remembered, as things that actually happened. This is a well-documented feature of vivid mental rehearsal, not a personal failing. Vividly imagined events leave memory traces that resemble real ones. So by the time the actual conversation happens, Ngozi isn't meeting it fresh. She's meeting it with a backlog of remembered feeling disasters that never occurred, each one adding weight to a scale that was never measuring anything real to begin with. Quick gut check, worth actually pausing on rather than skimming. Think of the last thing you rehearsed extensively in your head before it happened. Did the real version match any of your rehearsed versions closely enough to have been worth the rehearsal? Or did reality, as it usually does, go somewhere none of your scenarios predicted? Most people, once they actually check, find the honest answer deflating. That gap is the whole mechanism, visible in one memory. Point 3. Smart enough to argue your own reassurance. Call him Theo, 44, a corporate attorney whose job for 2 decades has been finding the flaw in an argument before the opposing side does. He told us something that, once you hear it, explains almost everything else about this pattern in high-functioning people. I can talk myself into feeling better about anything for about 90 seconds. Then I find the hole in my own reasoning, and I'm right back where I started, except now I also know my own reassurance doesn't hold up. This is the mechanism that makes overthinking so specifically resistant in intelligent people, and it's worth sitting with directly. The same critical faculty that catches flaws in a legal brief will, without being asked to, turn around and catch flaws in your own comforting thoughts. It'll probably be fine gets interrogated the same way a weak argument in court would. Where's the evidence? What about the counterexample? Isn't that a little convenient? And it loses almost every time, because reassurance was never built to survive cross-examination. It isn't supposed to be airtight. It's supposed to be enough to let you function while reality sorts itself out. A mind trained to demand airtight arguments will reject good enough reassurance as though it were a weak legal position, and keep searching for a stronger one that, by the nature of emotional uncertainty, doesn't exist to be found. This is why telling an overthinker, just stop worrying, it'll be fine, is not just unhelpful but almost insulting to how their mind actually works. They've already run that exact sentence through their own internal cross-examination and watched it fail. What they need isn't a stronger, reassuring argument. Arguments are the wrong tool entirely, because the loop was never actually an argument that could be won. It just looks like one. Theo's case also reveals something that surprises most people. The discomfort he's managing was never really about the specific worry on the surface. A client, a case, a decision he made that afternoon. It's about a background belief that if he ever stops examining a situation from every angle, something will slip past him and cause real damage, because that's exactly what his job has trained him correctly to prevent in a courtroom. The problem is that this vigilance doesn't have an off switch that only activates at the office. It runs continuously, applied indiscriminately to a text message from his daughter or a comment from a colleague with the same intensity it applies to a contested clause in a contract. The skill that makes him excellent at his job has colonized the rest of his mind, because nothing ever taught it where its jurisdiction should end. The reveal: you cannot outargue a feeling. Here's the piece that makes sense of all 3 mechanisms at once, and it's uncomfortable precisely because it can't be reasoned into, you can only recognize it. Overthinking presents itself as a search for the right answer, but underneath, it's usually an attempt to make an uncertain feeling go away by converting it into a solvable problem. Feelings don't resolve through analysis. They resolve through time, through action, or through being felt without being fixed. None of those are things a smart mind is naturally inclined to trust, because none of them look like solving anything. Femi wasn't solving his brother's comment. Ngozi wasn't preventing surprise. Theo wasn't finding better reassurance. Each of them was running a search for certainty in a domain that doesn't manufacture certainty no matter how long the search continues. And the smarter the searcher, the longer that search can convincingly masquerade as almost there, because a sharp mind is very good at generating the next plausible angle to try. This is worth stating even more plainly because it's the part people resist the most. There is no amount of thinking that will make an uncertain future certain or make another person's private feelings knowable in advance. Not more thinking, not smarter thinking, not one more pass. The uncertainty isn't a problem waiting to be cracked by sufficient intelligence. It's a structural feature of the situation, the same way you can't outcalculate the outcome of a coin flip no matter how carefully you study the coin. Once that's actually accepted, not just understood intellectually, but accepted, the loop loses its entire premise. It was always operating on the promise that one more round of analysis might finally deliver certainty. It never was going to. That promise was the fuel, and it was fake from the start. The experiment. You can't think your way out of a loop that's pretending to be thinking. You have to interrupt it structurally, from the outside, because the loop will always sound more urgent and more unfinished than it actually is from the inside. Here's the version that works. The next time you catch yourself mid-spiral, set a timer for 10 minutes and actually write the thought out, not think it. Write it, by hand or typed, doesn't matter which. When the timer ends, whatever state the thought is in, stop. Not because you've resolved it, because the time is up. Put it away, physically close the notebook or the document, and do something with your hands for at least 20 minutes before you're allowed to return to it if you still want to. The point isn't to solve the problem in 10 minutes. Most of the time you won't, and that's expected, not a failure. The point is to prove to the part of your brain that believes stopping equals abandoning the problem that stopping is survivable, that the world does not end, the problem does not silently worsen, and you are, in fact, still capable of functioning with an unresolved thought sitting quietly in the background instead of running the foreground of your mind. That's the actual skill being trained here. Not finding better answers. Tolerating the presence of an open question without needing to close it immediately. Do this every time the spiral starts for 1 week and track only one thing: how many times you were able to stop when the timer went off versus how many times you kept going anyway. That ratio is more informative than anything the spiral itself ever produced. The reframe. Femi's problem was never a lack of resolve. Ngozi's problem was never a lack of preparation. Theo's problem was never a weak argument. In every case, the mind was doing exactly what it was built to do, aimed at a target, emotional certainty, that thinking was never going to hit, no matter how long or how skillfully it kept trying. That's the pattern under why smart people can't stop overthinking. Not a flaw in the thinking. A mismatch between the tool and the job, running on a loop with no natural exit, because nothing has ever told the loop it's allowed to stop before it's finished, and it was never going to finish. If this is the voice that's been running in your head for years, the 10-minute timer is where to start, not a better argument with yourself. You've already tried that. It's part of the problem. And if you've ever wondered why the people who seem to have the clearest, most impressive external lives are sometimes the most afraid to actually go get the thing they want, that fear has its own mechanism, and it's not the one you'd guess. That's next on Mental Index.